Welcome everyone to this session on how purchasing practices shape human rights in shrimp supply chains. My name is Melissa Karadana, and I'm the Purchasing Practices Program Lead at the Ethical Trading Initiative. If you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. For those who are not familiar with ETI, we are a membership organization founded in 1998. So that's roughly 28 years ago. We are the owners of the ETI Base Code, which I'm sure of many of you heard about already. But it is a set of labor standards that set out minimum conditions for workers in supply chains based on the International Labour Organization's conventions. We are a tripartite organization, which means our membership includes NGOs, trade unions, and company members. Our aim is to provide practical advice and support to company members, mostly helping them to address salient human rights risks in their supply chain. Our approach is very closely aligned with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as emerging human rights legislation. But I think most importantly, we provide a safe space for convening stakeholders, bringing them together to speak about different topics, to find collaborative solutions to complex supply chain risks. But for those who want to know more, you can find more on our website for more information. Next, please. Yes, correct. The session today will be recorded. On the few housekeeping notes, session will be recorded. It is a public webinar, so we're not using Chatham House rules. So things that you maybe say could be quoted. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions and share reflections throughout the webinar. We will then gather questions and put them to our panelists during the discussion. We have also a few colleagues helping out to answer some of the questions automatically, Asi and Ella, and some external colleagues that will be with us here today as well, Hannah Bowles and Peter Alistair. If you can please go to the next slide. Also, just to say that if we don't get to your questions during the session, don't worry, we will respond to them afterward, either directly to you or through a follow-up blog article if needed. So today, the agenda. What we will be doing is going through some recent research ETI has conducted. I will share a summary of those findings, and then we will have a panel discussion scheduled with a very impressive group of stakeholders, moderated by a wonderful facilitator. We will also leave some time for you, for your questions and reflections during the session and to answer some of the questions in the panel discussion. And then I will be closing off with some next steps and looking ahead. If you can go to the next slide, please. So why are we here today? Today, I will be sharing some of the outcomes of the report we have been working on, which looks at human rights risks across the global shrimp supply chain and explores how labor standards are shaped along that chain. The shrimp industry, or the shrimp supply chain, like many other food supply chain, continues to face persistent human rights challenges, as you see in the diagram over there. Workers across hatcheries, farm, feed mills, processing facilities are experiencing low wages, long hours, unsafe conditions, insecure work, and in some cases, even forced labor. To give you a bit of an overview of what those risks looks like, we have split them up per country. I think, as you can see here, risks like freedom of association, safe and hygienic working conditions, unsafe and hygienic working conditions, and excessive working hours are challenges that we find across multiple countries. Over the past decades, a wide range of measures have been put in place to address these risks, including code of conduct, audits, certifications, grievance mechanisms, and impact assessment. Yet evidence from across the sector shows that serious labor rights issues and concerns continue to arise. And that's why we wrote this report, to take a step back, look at the sector as a whole, and examine how labor risks persist despite these efforts, and what this tells us about where our attention needs to shift to. Next, please. Now let's take a look a bit at each stage of the shrimp supply chain. I think what we see very clearly is that the risks to workers exist at every stage, and they are not limited to one supplier or to one country. The visual shows you a bit here along different supply chain types of and what kind of risks there are, which are most commonly found. So from hatcheries to farms to processing. Earlier, we looked at how these risks appear across countries. Here, the focus is really on which stage of production are they most affected. I'm just going to walk you through some. So hatcheries. In Indonesia and Vietnam, hatcheries tend to offer often more formal employment than farms, but wages are still quite below minimum wage. In India, workers often live on site, are required to be constantly on call, earn less than minimum wage, and local communities often are affected by hatchery wastewater. Shrimp feed production. So feed accounts for up to 40 to 60% of the cost of intensive shrimp farming. And key inputs include fish meal, soy, and wheat. Fish meal production, for example, particularly in Peru, has documented indicators of forced labor, including abuse and non-payment of wages. The feed market is quite highly consolidated, meaning a small number of companies have significant influence over cost and labor conditions upstream. Shrimp aquaculture farms. In Asia, most shrimp are produced on small-scale farms. Workers commonly face long working hours, informal employment, and wages linked to yield rather than to fixed pay. Occupational health and safety risks are high, with workers reporting injuries of electric shocks, skin infections, breathing problems, and chronic pain. In Ecuador, while direct evidence was a bit more limited, broader indicators pointed to intimidation, restricted collective bargaining, and threats to workers. Processing. So primary processing, including peeling sheds and home-based work, is highly labor intensive, often informal, and has been documented frequently paid below minimum wage, with workers supplying their own protective equipment. Secondary processing in factories can involve formal contracts, but high production targets and cold working environments can create pressures leading to injuries and restricted freedoms. Migrant workers in countries like Thailand, India, Vietnam face discrimination, limits on collective bargaining, and unsafe living conditions, particularly in company dormitories. So I think the key message here is that these risks are systemic. They occur across multiple tiers in different geographies, which means that they cannot be addressed by focusing on one single supplier or an audit or country alone. If you go to the next slide, please. So most companies rely on supply chain governance tools to manage human rights risks. Code of conduct set out expectations for suppliers. Audit and certification schemes provide external assessment of compliance for companies. Grievance mechanisms allow for workers to raise concerns, and human rights impact assessments identify risks and recommend remediation. And while these tools are widely used, our research indicates a structural compliance gap. These tools primarily operate downstream, monitoring supplier compliance, while upstream commercial decisions such as pricing, lead times, contract terms are not captured by these mechanisms. Evidence from the shrimp supply chain illustrates the limits of downstream governance tools as well. So, for example, shrimp farms in India, workers live often on site and in basic living conditions, or on call 24/7, working long hours of 12 hours plus and are paid low wages, often on a piece rate basis. In Vietnam, workers live on the farm and most request permissions to leave, even on non-working days. And these conditions have been documented even on certified farms, reflecting the well-documented limitations of audit-based certification in identifying and addressing labor issues. Processing factories in Vietnam and in Thailand and in India, high production targets. so often set to meet buyers' requirements, prevent workers from taking bathroom breaks and lead to injuries such as cuts, frostbite, and other cold-related harms. Cases have been documented of companies' dormitories also for restricted freedom of movement. And these are all audits captures only snapshots of these conditions and do not really fully reflect these systemic pressures as a whole. Grievance mechanisms, many exist in formal policy, but are inaccessible in practice. Migrant workers in Thailand, for example, face language barriers, fear punishment, and often lack knowledge of their labor rights and human rights impact assessments. So while many retailers and food companies have conducted human rights impact assessment, and published assessments are largely focused on supplier conditions and given quite limited limitation on the impacts of purchasing practices. So government tools, like including the audits, the certifications, grievance mechanisms, and impact assessments, have limitations in addressing labor risk. Even downstream, their methodology and implementation may not provide the full or realistic visibility of working conditions. Within the scope of this project, the focus is on one specific limitation, that these tools do not adequately capture the upstream pressures from buyers' purchasing practices, such as pricing, lead times, order volumes, and contracts, which can shape working conditions. So addressing human rights risk requires extending risk assessment beyond supplier level monitoring to include influences of buyer business decisions along the chain. Next, please. As mentioned, the understanding of what drives these risks also involves an assessment of purchasing practices. So the decisions buyers make around pricing, contracts, order volumes, lead times, and order flexibility. Ella, if you can click it a bit more through. And how these decisions then create pressures that then cascade down through the supply chain. This is not about individuals, buyers acting in bad faith. It is about how standard commercial practices can unintentionally create risks if their impacts are not examined. I think one of the clearest ways to see these pressures is through price. So to start with the UK market, between 2016 and 2025, the average retail price of warm water shrimp increased nearly by 19%, reaching £17 and 31 pence per kilogram. So consumers paying more. But if we look at the import prices, the picture is quite different. The prices UK buyers pay for shrimp from major producers have actually fallen over the same period. Ecuadorian shrimp is down for 19%, Indian shrimp is down for 11%, and processed shrimp from Indonesia has dropped by 41%. Now, globally, we see a similar trend. Ecuador and India have become the fastest growing exporters of frozen shrimp, but the prices they receive are lower than a decade ago. Processed shrimp from Indonesia, India, and Vietnam has also fallen in price. So now what does this mean on the ground? Like falling prices for producers put pressure on suppliers and workers. It can affect their wages, working conditions, and the ability of producers to invest in safer and more sustainable practices. If we don't consider these impacts, human rights risks might persist and working conditions remain poor, which is why reviewing these pressures is so important. Next, please. To make it a bit more visual, we have put together another table linking purchasing practices of the purchasing decisions to the ETI Base Code clauses. You can explore that more detailed in the full report, but what this highlights is that buying decisions can create real risks for workers' conditions along the supply chain. But purchasing practices is not just about price. Other purchasing decisions also shape working conditions along the supply chain. Order volumes, last-minute changes, and forecasting. Shrimp take 3 to 6 months to grow on an aquaculture farm and are highly sensitive to environmental conditions. Producers need accurate forecasts to plan production effectively and develop contingency plans. When demand is unpredictable or changes at short notice, the impacts are felt at downstream. For example, if there's too much shrimp, factories may hire temporary workers or outsource peeling to home-based workers. Both groups have fewer labor rights and no employment security. And if there's too little shrimp, formally employed primary processing workers may have no income or work. Another key issue is what we call hyperflexibility, where buyers expect suppliers to change order volumes or timelines at very short notice. Research from other sectors, especially in the garment industry, show that when buyers demand this level of flexibility, suppliers cannot rely on stable, permanent workforce. Instead, they respond by using overtime, hiring temporary workers, or subcontracting parts of the production. And this matters because temporary and subcontracted workers typically have fewer labor rights, less job security, and lower pay. Another example, in the 2016 ILO and ETI survey, covering over 1,400 workers across 87 different countries, found that buyers' demand for flexibility were associated with wages that were 6% lower to cope with demand peaks. 60% of the suppliers relied on overtime, 37% of suppliers hired temporary workers, and 16% subcontracted production. And I think we see a very similar dynamic in the shrimp supply chain. So across India, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, processors increasingly rely on intermediaries to secure enough shrimp to meet fluctuating buyer orders. But selling through intermediaries usually means farmers receive lower prices than if they sold directly to processing facilities. And when workers' pay is linked to yield or market price, as is quite common in shrimp processing, this directly reduces workers' earnings. So in practice, the flexibility demanded by the buyers doesn't disappear. It is pushed down the supply chain onto the farmers and to the farm workers. Also, contracts and payment terms, intermediaries or buyers may delay payments or structure contracts so the suppliers bear all the risk. And this can force suppliers to cut corners or rely on piece rate labor, leaving workers with unstable income and insecure employment. And then lastly, lead times and operational stress. So short lead times and unpredictable orders create operational pressures at farm and processing sites. Workers often endure unsafe conditions, handling chemicals, heavy loads, or working in very cold processing environments to meet tight deadlines. So I think what is the result of all of this is that farmers and factory workers are under financial and operational pressure. They face long hours, unsafe conditions, and low wages, and even also on factories that are audited or certified. Next, please. So what brings us to the next question is why we need to act. What does this mean for companies today in terms of human rights responsibilities and the risk of inaction? The UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights make clear that companies are responsible not only for impacts at supplier level, but also for harms linked to their own activities. So companies must avoid causing or contributing to human rights impacts and must seek to prevent or mitigate impacts directly linked to operations and business relationships. For retailers and food companies, this means looking how purchasing practices shape conditions in their supply chain. I think as evidence is shown in this report, when these practices are not addressed, pressure is pushed onto suppliers and ultimately on the workers, resulting in insecure, informal work and unsafe conditions. And this is really where the responsibility turns into a risk for companies. Regulators and courts are increasingly saying that ethical commitments means little if they're not reflected in how the supply chain actually operates. For example, in Italy, Giorgio Armani, a big luxury fashion brand, was fined 3.5 million because labor conditions at its supplier's factory didn't reflect the brand's ethical claims. Another case, Loro Piana, was placed under court supervision after authorities found labor exploitation at subcontracted workshops. Even though the abuses happened at the supplier side, the court stepped in at brand level. So I think the message is quite clear. Companies can no longer say that these problems are down the supply chain. If they not manage these risks properly, they face fines, legal action, and serious reputational damage. Also looking ahead, international and national legislation, for example, the CSDDD, will in the next years require companies to scope to identify, prevent, and mitigate adverse human rights and environmental impacts caused, contributed to, or directly linked to their business decisions, including their purchasing practices. So while acting now may appear voluntary, in reality, it's becoming standard practice. So companies that proactively raise their standards around purchasing practices now will be exposed less to later legal, financial, and reputational risks in the years to come. Next, please. I have spoken a bit, if you can click a bit through. Thank you. I've spoken a bit about the risks, the responsibility, and the consequences of inactions. So how do companies move from awareness to action, especially when it comes to purchasing practices? The good news is that companies don't have to figure it out this alone. There is a practical, collaborative way to start addressing purchasing practices, and that's what this project is about. So ETI has set up a three-phase practical project designed to help food companies and retailers better understand how their business decisions affect worker conditions and to start working on those decisions collectively. The project uses the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices in Food and focus mainly on three aspects, which are building internal understanding and engaging cross-functional teams, improving purchasing practices through collaboration and piloting new approaches with supply chains, and producing practical guidance that support wider industry uptake and informs policy reform. So overall, the project is very practical, collaborative, and focused on delivering real outcomes. Next, please. Two companies have already signed up, Tesco's and Morrison's. Unfortunately, I had to send my apologies. They couldn't join us today, but they kindly shared why they decided to take place. I'm going to read that out loud. So Tesco said, Tesco are committed to upholding human rights standards, and this includes responsible purchasing practices with our suppliers, as well as working closely with ETI this year on assessing our commercial practices. We are pleased to participate in this particular project on shrimp, ensuring that our farmers in Southeast Asia are able to uphold working conditions for workers. We look forward to working with the stakeholders to identify positive opportunities for continuous improvements. And Morrison said, our risk assessment processes and double materiality assessment have identified the shrimp sector as a particularly high-risk area within our supply chain. We identified engagement on responsible purchasing practices as necessary and therefore decided to join the ETI RPP shrimp project in order to work collectively to improve working conditions across the sector. Next, please. So just to summarize my presentation, first, I think human rights violations in the shrimp supply chain are widespread and systemic, not isolated incidents. So the research shows problems from hatcheries through processing and farms across multiple countries. Second is that audits, code of conduct, certifications, grievance mechanisms can't resolve these problems on their own. There are clear limits when it comes to labor risks. And third, upstream purchasing practices directly shape working conditions, and retailers have a very critical role to play. Acting now through the project allows companies to align commercial decisions with labor rights and strengthen that supplier relationship and reduces foreseeable risk backed by evidence. So there is a practical way forward for those who want to take it. And I think the choice is very clear. Act proactively or wait for the regulation and scrutiny to force the change. I'm going to hand over to our moderator today, Dr. Darian McBain, who will be leading a very exciting panel discussion. I'm going to hand over to you, Darian.
Thank you, Melissa. And that was a wonderful walkthrough of why we need this project and where it's going to be headed. So welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here today. And we have an amazing group of panelists to join us. A little bit about myself. I'm Darian McBain, and I have spent most of my life working in commodity supply chains, but took literally a deep dive into the seafood sector when I was the Chief Sustainability Officer for Thai Union. And at Thai Union at the time, we were the largest importer of shrimp into the United States through Thai Union and its various companies. We had processing, we had feed mills, we had hatcheries, we had farms, we had many contract suppliers all over the region. So I really spent a lot of time working on shrimp, and it continues to occupy my time now that I'm a consultant and I've left Thai Union. For full transparency, I'll say I do work with Monterey Bay Aquarium as a senior fellow for a just nature transition on shrimp, and also with the Yield Lab Asia Pacific, which invests in a lot of aquaculture innovation in the region. But today we're looking at human rights in shrimp supply chains. And I was reading with interest this morning that the UK Competition Markets Authority has warned retailers that they will be on the hook for any greenwashing that their suppliers may make. And I think that's interesting concept to come into this discussion, although they were mostly talking about environmental claims. Of course, human rights claims can be the same. If you are making a claim and you're a retailer, how much do you understand about what's happening in your supply chain? And how much do you understand about what your purchasing practices are causing influence within those supply chains? So we have here today a great, wonderful group of different experts who are bringing their different perspectives. So we have Anyamanee Tabtimsri, who is the program officer from the ILO. So she'll be bringing a global perspective. We have Kirill Buketov, policy officer for the IUF, who's bringing a worker voice and union perspective. We have Roisai Wongsuban, who is an independent consultant in human rights and seafood, who is bringing a supplier perspective, and Aimee Kelly, the ethical sourcing operations manager from the Coles Group, who's bringing a retailer perspective. To all my panelists, welcome and thank you for being here. So let's dive into the questions. We're going to break it up looking at kind of three different perspectives: the cause of these problems, the impact that they have, and then the solutions, because it's the solutions that we're really most interested in, because that's where this work with the ETI is going to go moving forward. Okay, so round one of questions, and I'll ask my panelists, even though you could speak at length, maybe to keep your responses to around 3-4 minutes. How about we look at which purchasing practices are most directly shaping worker conditions in shrimp supply chains? So maybe Anyamanee, I'll come to you first for that ILO perspective. Based on the ILO's experience in shrimp supply chains, what workplace or operational challenges most affect the implementation of labor standards like wages, working hours, and freedom of association?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Melissa from ETI and Darian for the introduction. So let me start with a brief introduction about the Ship-to-Shore Rights project that I'm working with. You know about the ILO for sure, but some of you may not familiar with the ILO Ship-to-Shore Rights Southeast Asia. And this project is an EU-funded initiative, and we work to promote safe migration and decent work across the fishing, seafood, and aquaculture sectors, particularly in Southeast Asia. So to say that I will give a global perspective might not quite correct, because I cannot go beyond my scope, which is Southeast Asia. And because the project is only work in Cambodia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. So my focus is mostly in Thailand. And it's good to see that Kun Roisai will also here to give a perspective from the human rights perspective. So our work is actually cover the broader seafood supply chain. So not only shrimp, but for this discussion, so I will draw the findings from our research that conducted in 2022 with over 1,200 returned migrant workers who work from Cambodia, who are from Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Vietnam, as well as my working experience in Thailand. So I try to be short, even though the finding is quite interesting, but you can read it later if you like. From the study, it shows that there are several workplace challenges that affecting the labor standards and also contributing to the critical labor issues. The first one is the high migration costs, and that's a major concern because many workers have to pay a lot of high recruitment fees, and sometimes not only from their home country, but at the destination country as well. And with that situation, it creates a debt situation, and that, as you know, increase the vulnerability to the forced labor. And the second, it's about the wage compliance gaps. In Thailand, for example, some workers still receive a below minimum wage. In this research, we are capture those in fishing vessel sector and in the factory sectors. So in this case, it's mostly happen in the fishing sectors and also the informal seafood sectors, like a small peeling shade businesses. And the third part is about workplace safety, which is still very lacking. The percentage of seafood processing worker who reported injuries is nearly 30%, which I think is rather high considering the size of the businesses. And mostly the cause is due to the cuts or the slips because it's very slippery in the fishing boat and sometimes in the factory itself, and coal-related injuries. And this issue also often linked to inadequate provision of the PPE and also limited training on occupational safety and health. This apply also mostly in the environment of fishing vessels. The fourth issues that I'm going to share is about the mobility to change the job, because from our research, from our study, it say that around 18% of workers, they said they are able to change employers. So there are more than 70% who are quite strict and have a limited opportunity. So it's hard for them to leave the workplace if they are facing or encountering the poor condition at work. The fifth one is about, I think ETI research also touching upon on this, the extreme limit on freedom of association. From the research, only about 10% of our workers respondent. They said that they belongs to a trade union or migrant association. And since the migrant workers, especially in Thailand, they cannot form their own union or taking leadership roles. So their ability for them to negotiate or to raise the concern is also pretty limited. And the last one, I hope I still keep in time. The last one, when they facing or encountering some issues, they also hesitate to seek formal help. That often due to the fear or a lack of trust to the authority. And it shows that we still need an efficient, effective, accessible grievance mechanism in the industry. And I just have to mention this, that because our project does not directly work on the purchasing practices yet. Of course, we work across the supply chain, but not particularly on purchasing practices yet. But our findings somehow can be linked and show that there are many of these labor issues cannot be addressed only at the factory levels. And I think ETI research study can reflect very well on this. For example, the high recruitment fee or the wage pressure, the arch gaps, workers' voice issue, all this also help shape some of the problem in the industry. So from the supplier perspective that we hear, the project usually mostly work with the industry association, not directly with the company itself. They also raise a question about this price, the cost for compliance, because for them, this contributed also in part of their financial burden. So this is some of the question that we can discuss later. So just to wrap up, I think the labor standards and the purchasing practices, responsible purchasing practices are somehow interconnected. So we need both the labor standards at to comply, but not only that, the purchasing practices from the buyer itself, the action from the buyer itself are also very essential to make this labor standards achievable. So I think
Thank
that's
you,
it for me.
Anyamanee.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. And you've brought up so many points that I'm sure we're going to touch on. And the Ship to Shore program has been uncovering some great programs throughout the years. Now, one of the things you touched on was worker representation. I think it's a great opportunity to turn to Kirill. What challenges do workers in the seafood sector face in organizing, being represented, or raising concerns about their worker conditions?
Thank you, Darian. First of all, maybe a few words about my organization. The IEF is an international union of food and agricultural workers, and we operate in more than 130 countries, but not directly. We are a federation of national unions, the trade unions which represent workers employed in agriculture and over the whole food industry. And that includes fish processing, it includes seafood processing and fish farming, and all elements of what we call the global seafood industry. We approached at the international level to bring together the unions which represent the workers in the sector. We brought them together in 2016, 10 years ago, for the international conference to collect the information and try to understand what is happening in this sector. And what we're discussing now about shrimps, I fully agree with Annie that it cannot be disconnected with the general situation in seafood and fish sector. It's only one of the elements of the global problematic sector, probably the most problematic. I can tell you that we represent workers in many different segments of the global food industry. We never came across that size of the problem. The medieval labor practices, the disciplinary measures, which include death penalty, you will not find it anywhere in any other food sector, and not in any other industrial sector. You know, things related to gender-based violence and different practices, which include fish for sex, you can hardly find it anywhere else. So our first finding and reports from our members was the terrible, the most difficult and terrible human rights situation, and lots of cases of violation of human rights. Second finding was inability of the workers of this sector to impact on this. In many other sectors, workers can organize in a union, and that is a vehicle to change the working conditions. In this sector, there are so many additional obstacles which don't exist in other sectors, which prevent workers from organizing. And one of the elements of this was the lack of international attention and the international standards. What we also figured out, and this was our third conclusion of this meeting, was that actually there are no international standards applicable to this sector. In many countries, the governments were trying to deal with identifying the problems and trying to deal with elements of these problems, but the approach was different. Even there is no standard system of governance. In some countries, aquaculture will fall under the jurisdiction of agricultural ministry, in some other countries under maritime, in some other countries something else. So there is no common approach to this, and there is no expertise coming from the international level to actually tell the governments on how this sector has to be regulated, including the working conditions and health and safety conditions. So this was our third finding. And what we concluded and what we decided to do 10 years ago, that we will build a better coordination of the workers in the sector with two priorities for us. One is to assist and help the workers in the sector, those who are trying to organize in different countries. And you probably noticed, and also that relates also to the shrimp sector, that the number of the workers' activities, collective action in defense of the workers' rights and with the demand to change the working conditions is increasing from year to year. And our second priority area of intervention was to try to influence the international governance system to make sure that there are international standards developed for this sector. It took us several years. In 2021 was the first discussion in the ILO, first ever in the history discussion in ILO looking at working conditions in aquaculture. That produced a number of recommendations, and following these recommendations, there is now a system of standards is under development. 5 years is not enough to have it fully developed, but I just will mention a couple of very important instruments developed as a result of this process. One of them was in 2023, there was the ILO developed a special policy guidelines to address decent work deficits in agri-food sector, which includes aquaculture. There was recently 2025, last year, we announced a new policy guidelines on elimination of child labor in fisheries and aquaculture. This was jointly produced by the FAO and the ILO. And currently, for May this year, we are planning to get engaged in a tripartite discussion within the ILO, which will be developing a code of practice on occupational health and safety in aquaculture that will cover the shrimp sector. So these are the important elements, and I can talk more in details of this, but I don't want to steal the time from other speakers.
Certainly not stealing the panel, and that's some sobering statistics that you've given us, but great to know that some guidance is being developed. Roisai, I might turn to you now. I mean, you have long been working with and in the seafood sector in Thailand. I mean, what pressures do purchasing practice create in shrimp supply chains from what you've seen?
I think one of the obvious evidence is that Thai shrimp farmers are not rewarded by the market, and the statistic has shown in terms of pressure. Most of the shrimp farmers are, I'm sorry, I forget to mention that I'm actually based in Surat Thani, which is the hub of shrimp aquaculture farming in Thailand. So then I have a chance to talk with a lot of shrimp farmer and some shrimp broker and processors, and I think they have a lot to say, but there are not always the opportunity in the international forum for them to express their view. I think if you work in the supply chain, you know that most of the people at the stream of the supply chain, they fear to make comment or complain against on the subject because they fear that their complaint will be used to control the purchasing practice as well. So I think what the pressure that the company put on the shrimp supply chain is that they ask to incorporate sustainability and human rights in the production. And if you monitor the situation of Thai shrimp industry, I think we have made a lot of improvement, even though it's not yet certified. However, the market does not reward the improved practice for the Thai shrimp farmer. For example, in 2025, we actually export 129,308 tons of shrimp to the international market. It seems to be a lot number, but actually it's lower than 2024, and we are actually on the downtrend of export of the shrimp. US is still our major market, which is taken up 25% of the share in terms of export destination for us, followed by Japan and China. And China is only market that actually has high demand of the Thai shrimp. And what is it say about that? It means that actually it's all about price and cost. Even though you incorporate the good practice, but the price still the major decision for the buyer whether they will outsource shrimp from Thailand or not. Thai shrimp farmers are fear for the rival like Ecuador, as they realize that Thailand will never compete for the same cost of production. If Thailand need to maintain the standard of the good practice like energy, human rights, labor rights, the increased cost for the responsible recruitment of the migrant worker in this context. And when purchasing all come down to the price, we think most of the farmer complain that the farm gate price doesn't reflect the investment in ethics and sustainability. And a lot of Thai farmers believe that they have made advance or improvement on the various aspects of human rights. However, the market does not reward them enough. And when the shrimp farmer experience the pressure on the price, this pressure particularly pass on the worker. Actually, after the issue of U.S. tariff was introduced last year, we heard directly from the worker that they have to work extra in terms of productivity. They have to be more on speed, less rest at the company because the processor or the company often tell them that we need to keep the price low in order to maintain in the market. And for shrimp farmer themselves, they only view that in order to survive in the industry, they have to control the cost as much as they could. And the sustainability practices are the second or third priority in order to survive in this industry. And I think this is the big question back to the purchasing practices. If we don't have system to reward the people who commit for the sustainability and human rights, the practice will not be sustained for very long. Thank you.
Thank you, Roisai, and I think you are very correct in pointing out that we need market signals to reward good behavior just as much as there needs to be some kind of response to poor behavior. Now, turning to Aimee, you work for the Coles Group, a very significant retailer in Australia. What first prompted you to have conversations about responsible purchasing practices at Coles, and what have you learned about engaging different internal teams along the way?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having us to participate in this webinar today. And we've really enjoyed, I guess, engaging with ETI to date on our RPP approach, and we hope that continues. So I guess what prompted the conversations within Coles, it was based on years of implementing our ethical sourcing program. And as Melissa highlighted in her presentation, we know that not every situation fits neatly into a compliance framework. However, compliance will always remain important. But for us, managing human rights risk is just as much about cultures, behaviors, and shared principles as it is about policies and audits. So responsible purchasing is not necessarily a new concept to Coles. It's always been a part of how we aim to work with our suppliers. But what is really evolving is our commitment to embedding these practices more intentionally and consistently across our teams. So to support this shift, we first needed to understand, I guess, the current state of operations in play. Particularly looking at the dynamics of a fast-moving retail environment characterized by high volumes and low margins. So to do this, we engage with other brands to learn how they have embedded responsible purchasing strategies, such as collaborative production planning, strengthening partnerships, and shared responsibilities, which really shaped our way forward. From here, then, we designed a responsible purchasing practice assessment tool to better understand how our commercial teams are working in practice, really understanding the pressures they navigate and where there are opportunities to critically strengthen our purchasing practices, which gave us a structured way to surface both good practice and areas for opportunity while being really grounded in the commercial realities of everyday buying processes. Through phase one of our pilot, we saw that our commercial teams operate very differently across different categories, with different sourcing pathways, level of visibilities, and degree of leverage. But I guess the critical insight that came through, which wouldn't necessarily surprise anyone, is those long-term strategic supplier relationships are really critical. It's these relationships for us that create the trust and transparency to really talk openly about capacity, lead times, constraints, and the real world reality for the workers on the ground. We also have learned through phase one of our pilot approach on understanding responsible purchasing internally more deeply, that raising awareness internally of the potential impacts of commercial decisions is essential. Embedding responsible purchasing really requires that shared understanding across commercial, technical, and sourcing teams, how everyday decisions from forecasting to cost pressure can really shape supplier behavior and labor conditions. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's wonderful to know that Coles is taking purchasing practices seriously and already starting to work on improvements. Now, that ends sort of round one of my questions, and I want to now move on to the impact and what enables compliance with the ETI Base Code. Just a reminder to everyone, pop your questions into the Q&A to our panelists. Have a look. If a question comes up that you can answer, please feel free to do that while we're chatting, and then we'll try to address any other questions after we've gone through the next round of discussions. Okay, so maybe we'll start with Anyamanee and the ILO perspective. Anyamanee, how does the Good Labour Practices program help translate labour standards into practice, and where does it depend on buyer engagement to work?
Okay. Thank you for the question again. So I just briefly give you some overview about the seafood good labor practice. I will just put it short as a seafood GLP from now on. This program is a voluntary and is industry-led initiative, and we focus on the employers' practices at the factory level, some on the things like the contracts or wages, welfare, working conditions in the factories, and an overall labor management system. And one of the key strengths is that it was designed in Thailand for Thailand only and led by the industry, the Thai Tuna Association Industry and the Thai Frozen Food Association of Thailand, so that they have their kind of own ownership that helps ensure that the program is practical and trusted by among the employer themselves. And the purpose of the seafood GLP is to support the employer compliance with both Thai labor law and also lift up international labor standards. And the program sets kind of 9 principles and also provide employer training to raise their awareness about the labor standard, human rights, due diligence, and also the industry, they conduct recurring on-site visits to assess how well the factories are doing and to also giving some recommendations for the change. And so just to emphasize that this GLP has this seafood GLP has a kind of focus on the export facing suppliers. So this is the first tier, but in the near future, under this current phase of the ship to shore rights, we try to expand it also in their supply chains, like in fishing vessels and aquaculture if possible, but we will have to see the possibility on that. And as I said, these are one of the strange is that these factories are exposed to the market pressure and buyer expectation. And so they kind of aware of reputational risk if they didn't follow the international standards. So they have some kind of strong incentive to improve and to work with us. But again, but with this program, as I said, we're still working only at the factory levels, especially the big enterprise. So the weaknesses of this program is implementing with the small and medium-sized enterprises and a lower tier of the supply chain. So as I said, we try to address this gap in the near future and to expand deeper into this participating company supply chain. And just to give you a little bit of the progress that we made with this seafood GLP, we now implement this program with 88 factories and it's impacted more than 77,000 workers under the monitoring approach. And through this program, just to show you that it's not just the program, but the industry itself who paid a recurring visit to these factories, they also identify some of the areas of non-compliance. For example, the inconsistency in employment contracts and payslip. Some in the past, some of these workers, and as you may know, these workers, the majority of the workers are Myanmar or Cambodia working in these factories, and they cannot read Thai, of course. So the advice from the industry is to translate the contracts and the pay slips for the migrant worker to understand. And also they identify some insufficiency for provision of the PPE, or there's a limitation of workers' participation in workers' welfare committee, because in Thailand, if you are the enterprise over 50 workers, you're supposed to have worker welfare committees who can participate and have a kind of conversation with the owner of the company. So these findings point that these are kind of structural weaknesses in the factory system, not only the compliance, and also in terms of workers' protection. anyhow, talking about this improvement, there are still some more work to do with this under this program, because we try to increase more participation of migrant workers in the Workers' Welfare Committee. Grievance mechanism has to be strengthened, and also one of the good things, start working with this industry from the beginning. We started since 2019 under this program. We see also some shift on the mindset of the employer mindset, but one of the factor is maybe the pressure from the buyers would be helpful in changing this mindset as well. So I think I will keep my response on the engagement with the buyers, how it's helped to how the engagement with the buyers working with this to support this program in the last session when we come back with the recommendation from our side. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Anyamanee. Great to know that buyer pressure has led to some improved outcomes. Maybe over to you, Kirill. We hear a lot about the role of worker voice programs. What role does genuine worker voice play in identifying when purchasing practices are undermining rights?
That is a very good question, and I like the formulation, the genuine worker's voice. I think we need to start with terminology here. What is a genuine worker's voice, and what is the other worker's voice? In the history of the humanity, we know that the workers were deciding what should be their voice themselves, and that is making a genuine worker's voice. And this worker's voice is called trade union. Trade union is an organization which gives people their rights, which they cannot access individually. The trade union is giving them the access to the collective rights. And that is part of the big system created more than 100 years ago, and it's called the International Labour Organization. The trade unions are part of this, and this is where the workers are equal part with the employers and with the governments, making sure that they are involved and included in the discussion on the workers' conditions and on the rights. So this is really critical for us, because when we started our work closely on this sector 10 years ago, this was a time when there were lots of media expose talking about quite terrible situations in the seafood and fisheries. And the response of the industry, which we saw on these reports, was an attempt to create a network of a system of very many certification mechanisms. Those certification mechanisms were everywhere, but then they were all coming under question on how reliable they are and what they really change if the workplace is certified by this or another mechanism. So then we saw another interesting phenomena, a growing, mushrooming number of organizations which were called workers' voice. Normally, they were not representative. They were few people, small business, going around saying this certification is okay. And I'm mentioning this because it was a massive process which didn't help to change the situation. What can change the situation is a trade union organization. And I give you just one example. One of the countries which is a key country for sourcing the shrimps and aquaculture is not allowing the workers to organize freely because it did not ratify the ILO Fundamental Conventions on Freedom of Association. Just openly says we're not going to do it. It also openly says we're not going to give the migrant workers the right to organize in a union. Instead, we will be creating welfare committees, different sorts of representative organizations, etc. The first attempt of this government, of this country, to the criticism from the international level on the human rights, massive human rights violations in the sector was to create labor inspection and send labor inspectors to inspect every workplace. And I met one of these labor inspectors at the international conference. He was quite frustrated, coming for an advice from the international community. He said, I was just visiting a big shrimp peeling factory. And I was talking to the workers. They're all migrant workers, more than 1,000 female workers working 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And their conditions are really, really poor. And I was telling them, your conditions are very poor. They need to be changed. He used the wording like slave-like conditions. And he said, the workers told me, no, we're happy here. This is a good salary and it's a good working conditions, because they had nothing to compare with in their life, in their biography. And he was asking for an advice of what he can do to change it. But the real answer to this, you cannot. The labor inspector, a worker voice NGO, a police officer cannot impact on people's mind. Only the workers who have experience of organizing themselves, going through the collective action to change their working conditions, can explain to other workers what really the miserability of their situation is and what they can do to change it. So worker talking to worker through the union organization. The union organization gives, as I said, the collective rights. If something is wrong with this right, which is enabling other rights, there is an ILO procedure. And what I can advise everyone, if you're looking at purchasing of anything from anywhere, the first thing to do is to go to the ILO database and see if this country has ratified the Freedom Association Conventions, and if there are any complaints about this country violating the Freedom Association Convention. That should be the number one step in building a responsible purchasing pathways.
Okay, thank you. That is a really good perspective on what genuine worker voice is, worker-to-worker dialogue. Thank you, Kirill. Roisai, over to you. What supply chain stakeholders are asked to meet labor standards or certification requirements, know when they are? Where do these expectations clash with the commercial realities? Because you were speaking about the commercial reality so eloquently in your last response. And I'm sorry to all our panelists, but I'm going to have to ask you to keep it fairly succinct so that we can get on to the Q&A after this. Roisai.
Okay, let me be precise and echo the voice of the farmer. Certification is just the entry of the market, but it's not always guarantee the farmer that they will get fair price and continuous improvement. Farmer complain that they used to get pay higher to after they be certified, but nowadays it's no longer a practice. However, most of the farmer try to maintain the good relationship with the processor and exporter as retailer demand for the either audit or certification. Most of the farmers don't believe there is a transparency in standard of compliance because they compare the situation of the farming system in different countries. Last year, there were a lot of international news report on other countries like India, Vietnam, and Ecuador. But those countries, the farmers are certified even higher than Thailand. So I think most of the farmers are aware that the certification is the demand for one side and not reward again to the people who commit for the change. And they've been fed up because they've been audited by the government, inspection by the labor inspector and the auditor from different certificate scheme. But at the end of the day, there is no fair share of cost. There is no commitment to invest for improvement of the farm or any other purchasing condition that will allow them to believe if they invest more, if they share the value with the people in their own supply chain, then there will be reward from the market. That will be my response. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think having a fair share is an important underlying feature of the discussions that you've raised. Aimee, to you. If you're asking suppliers to reflect on purchasing practices, then that is putting them in a situation where they have to reflect on buyers' own commercial behaviors, which is still quite an unusual approach. How did suppliers engage with the conversation, and what did your team learn from that dialogue?
Thank you. I guess from the inception of this approach, yes, it is novel, and you could sense the supplier's uneasiness at the concept of reviewing our performance. But what we tried to really ensure was that the supplier understood that as honest and transparent as they could be was really critical to helping us understand where our approaches, our practices may unintentionally create pressure. And without this information, we couldn't improve as buyers. So for this approach, particularly phase one, and as we continue into phase two, we have selected long-standing supplier partners to pilot this approach and to try and create a safe, kind of open and constructive environment. The survey tool that we use to engage our suppliers in terms of assessing our buying practices was built around the ETI Common Assessment Framework on food. So focusing on the key pillars of internal integration, equal partnership, collaborative production planning, fair payment terms, and selected and sustainable costing. So from phase one of the approach with this survey, we learned the following from our key suppliers: that continuity in buying teams is really important. So suppliers' feedback highlighted that turnover or changes in our project ownership can disrupt workflows and can create delays, reinforcing the importance to us of maintaining consistent relationships and knowledge within our buying teams. So ensuring important handover and maintaining that trust within the relationship. Improved forecasting and planning is an area that we can continue to strengthen. So suppliers noted that more consistent and earlier sharing of forecasts would help them better manage capacity, align production cycles, and reduce operational stress. And this has been highlighted through today's panel. Incentives matter. While labor standards compliance is expected, suppliers indicated that recognizing or rewarding those who exceed baseline requirements could really help drive stronger labor outcomes across the supply base. And lastly, costing transparency. So whilst open costing is widely used, labor costs are often bundled together. There's definitely an opportunity to explore clearer labor cost visibility, particularly for us as we continue to develop our living wage framework. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Trust and transparency, I think, can go a long way when working on a project like this. Now we're moving on to our final round of questions, and then we'll go on to the Q&A. So as always, please pop your questions in the chat. Panelists, please look if you can answer something online. Please do. Okay, I'm going to ask this to be a lightning round, 1 minute responses, panelists, because this is the work going forward with the ETI. So hopefully everybody can engage. So this is, some of the solutions. What's good going to look like? Aimee, I'm going to stay with you. Looking ahead, where do you see the biggest opportunities for retailers to strengthen responsible purchasing practices, and what are some of the priorities that you are focusing on over the next few years?
Thank you. I guess for us, as I've highlighted throughout, is really integrating responsible purchasing practices into the core of our decision making. And to do this, what we're really focusing on over the next few years is building our internal capability. So developing practical, accessible training that really demystifies responsible purchasing, because we know our teams are doing it, but what we can do to equip teams with the tools to assess lead times, capacity constraints, and cost pressures through a human rights lens, which I think is critical. And then really looking at opportunities to embed human rights considerations into daily commercial decision making, and ensuring that aligns with what good buying looks like. We are looking at developing a tailored responsible purchasing strategy. We've drafted a responsible purchasing policy. So what we really need to do now is test that it works for all of our different commercial teams, and strengthening cross-functional alignment and accountability. So integrating human rights considerations to internal scorecards, planning cycles, and ways of working. And lastly, really looking at deepening supplier collaboration. So again, to highlight the point of exploring incentives that recognize suppliers who invest in strong labor practices beyond just that minimum compliance of meeting kind of social audit requirements. So that's the focus for us.
Thank you. I love that you're looking internally to do some of this work, because so often supply chain work just gets pushed along the chain. So thanks for that response. Roisai, to you, again, a 1-minute response. What changes in buyer behavior would make it easier to sustain decent work?
Price. Price is the biggest priority in the supply chain. If farmers feel that they receive adequate price, they can ensure that standards are upheld. The price pressures are always translate from the processor to farmer to the employee at the end of the production. I actually asked on other practices with the farmer, like a long-term engagement or the quota system, but because the nature of aquaculture is very fluctuated and high risk. For example, last year we had the disaster, the flood in the Southeast Asia, and it affects shrimp production. So after commitment from the shrimp farmer, they fear that they may not be delivered that because it's now more high risk for the shrimp farm industry. So, and another request from the shrimp farmer is the engagement and stick with your suppliers to make improvement, and making sure that they have time to improve and change and get the fair share. That will be all from my end. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Price, and long-term engagement. Anyamanee, moving to you, what are the most important actions buyers or supply chain partners can take to support decent work?
Okay, thank you. And before that, let me also to add that in Thailand, the ILO and the project itself is now working for some times to move towards the ratification of C87 and 98. So we see that where it's the most important work that Thailand should ratify, but of course it's a long process. But just to ensure you that we are seeing this the most important from our side. And also to add that the seafood GLP that we are working with that industry is not a certification system. It's not that kind of scheme, but we try to make them understand that to create a credible program, it's only to hear of the voice of the workers. So we try to engage the CSO and the workers with the industry and the factory themselves. So we see a little progress by that, but it's still a long way to go. So in terms of the suggestion that on the actions from the buyer itself, I have a few points, but I will try to be very, very short. I know the time is coming short. From our experience, I think the first thing is about incentivizing those suppliers who demonstrate that they comply and have a strong compliance with the labor standards. And with that, it comes to Roisai's suggestion again that it's not only that, but you need to reward them from doing that a good job, so that they see that if they are active actors, they have something that they should be rewarded. And the second one is buyers can also help support capacity building for the suppliers, especially for the many small and medium enterprises or the upstream producer who may have the willingness to do that, to comply, but they might not have a sufficient resources or technical knowledge. So I think this is something maybe ETI could support, or some organization could help in doing this thing. And the third one is about the supplier themselves should also seek the information about working condition in the supply chain without relying only on those audits information or certification system, because as I said, to hear from the workers themselves or the CSO who work on the ground, you will see the reality of the situation and the working conditions. And building the relationship with this civil society organization is also, and trade union of course, is very important, so that they can see the reality themselves. And the last one,
I think that might be
okay.
all we have time
Okay.
for, but I do encourage you, pop any further thoughts into the chat so everyone else can see it. Kirill, the last word goes to you. My question is, how can purchasing practices be designed to strengthen rather than undermine worker representation and collective voice? And to my other panelists, while Kirill is answering, please get on the Q&A and answer any of the questions that might have appeared there. Thank you. Kirill, over to you.
Wow, the question is not answerable in 1 minute, but if
So you can signpost us to where else we could go.
But if I try, I would like to refer to what was said earlier by Annie, referring to the study which was made. One of the biggest problems in this sector is a fear. The workers are afraid. So if you want to design any practice which is responsible, it has to be aimed at eliminating this fear. And eliminating this fear means setting up a democratic workplace where workers can exercise their fundamental human rights without fear of intimidation or prosecution. That's the short answer.
I think that's a great answer to land on, because it's very human focused, isn't it? None of us want to work in fear. So a great place to land. Now, Melissa, I'm going to look to you. Do we have time to take one question before we come back to the ETI?
I think you can do one question and then that's it. Sorry for the time.
Wonderful. Was there a question that you particularly wanted answered? Otherwise, there's one that's close to my heart, which I would ask, which is, how can sustainability teams engage buyers and other departments in retail brands to reevaluate their purchasing practices? It's a very practical one too, and so on. Anyone from our panelists have a response to that? Maybe I'll come to Roisai. Have you had any experience on how sustainability teams can engage with retailers?
Because there is a need of procurement planning and improvement, I think most of the farmers are trying to pass the audit, and they never had any conversation about cost sharing or responsibility sharing to remediate any violation that may occur in the past, from the issue of land rights, labor rights, or energy transition. I think, as Kirill say, they fear if they share the reality, it will be punishment to cut off from the supply chain. So and I think this is very important. For some farmer, they also share that some retailer has a very good practice to sit down and help sponsor the certification and seed fund to help improvement the farm after the assessment. But it means that they develop like a 10 years partnership commercial relationship in order to move to that stage. But again, this is the question that I felt like retailer need to sit down and engage with their own suppliers to go over the fear that kept everyone, in their own space. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's a great place to end on, because the project, Melissa, that you're going to talk about is all about how we can engage with retailers and the shrimp value chain. So thank you very much to my panelists. The questions are brilliant, but they would take a little bit longer to answer. So Melissa, maybe you can explain how people can continue the conversation. And thank you to all my panelists.
Thank you, Darian, and thank you to you too for the great moderating, and thank you all panelists for all your insight and expertise. I think as the panel showcased, the risks are there, they're severe, and despite effort to address these risks, they remain. But through trust and long-term transparency, we can go a long way. I think purchasing practices is something that we need to look at, and where there is a way, there's an opportunity. As stated before, we're offering companies, both ETI and non-ETI members, as in food companies, retailers, global producers, to have a chance to join this initiative, to work together in a very structural manner on understanding how we're currently buying and how these buying decisions by individual companies affect supply chain stakeholders and what we can do about it. ETI will be guiding the companies through a 3-phase project where we support them, start trialing and improving, and work together to promote credible outcomes for workers. We have a few requirements. That is that at least one person from human rights ethical teams join, and along with a person from buying and from a buying position. And secondly, signing an MOU agreeing to participate in the project. So for those on the call today that think, okay, this sounds really interesting, please reach out to me via my email address and we can set up a call. I'm also, next please. We also working really hard to get the reports up and running and to share with you all. For those who have signed up to the ETI newsletter, you will receive the report automatically. We will also be sharing the reports online and on LinkedIn. Just to say on the Q&A questions today that we have not yet answered, we will get back to you through probably a blog or reaching out directly to you in this chat and sharing it out further. But if you have any more questions or you want to know more about the project, about research, please feel free to stay in touch. Then I just want to say one more time a big thank you to all panelists, Darian and everybody who joined in and listened today. Thanks very much, and yeah, appreciated your time. Our next ETI Insights series will be on the 10th of March on guidance and in-country perspectives on applying mandatory human rights due diligence. Thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate your time. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.